Hey, Kelsie.
Hey, Brooke.
Want to tell everyone what's happening in today's episode?
Today, we are going to be talking about the first female elected to a position of power post-colonialism in Africa.
Oh, I was like, what country are we in? Because it's not the U.S.
When are we? Dun, 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 dun.
Let's get into it.
Hello, and welcome to Remedial Herstory, the other 50%, the podcast that explores what happened to the women in history class. Now, here's your host, Kelsie Brooke Eckert, and her partner in crime, Brooke Neva Sullivan.
All right, Brooke, her name was Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, and today I had a wonderful opportunity to interview Professor Pamela Scully. She is a professor of women's studies. It's complicated. Women, gender, and sexuality studies, because those are different. We conflate them regularly on our podcast.
Yikes.
Get it right. African studies at Emory University in Atlanta. And this was like such an absolute honor to talk to her about this amazing woman. So she is the president. She becomes the president of Liberia twice, 2006 to 2018. You know, it's funny, when I first got her proposal for this interview, one of the things that I was thinking about was just the rich tradition of female leadership in Africa when you go back centuries.
Wow.
And, you know, think like Cleopatra. Everybody knows about Cleopatra. She's a queen of Africa, right? An empress of Africa. We've got queens in all, you know, Songhai, Mali, like all of these amazing.
And I feel like we don't bring them into the classroom enough or talk about them enough. And I don't know, why is that?
Oh, well, I think one of the things that I'm realizing being a professor who teaches world history is just how, one, I don't know enough about all of these places in the world. That's part one. Part two, sources. Like a lot of the things that I've read about African history, they all cite European men who explored in those places and what they wrote about those places. We have a great lesson plan about the Dahomey Amazons on our website. And building that lesson plan was so hard because, you know, there's this great film out starring Viola Davis now. And it's like, oh, this is great. But like, what actual documents are they using to like inform that? Yeah. And granted, you know, I didn't do a ton of the research on this. Our team, you know, we had a team of people that pulled this lesson plan together, but it's a lot of like European men writing about what they witnessed of the Dahomey. And
so you have that.
That's like clouded in perspective, racism, male, you know, patriarchy, maleness. There's sort of this like barbarianism, you know, going on where it's like we, you know, all-knowing European blah, 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 blah. Like
civilized culture versus uncivilized culture.
At this, like, uncivilized in quotes, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
Define how you want. And then the things that we have from the Dahomey that survive are artifacts. There are these beautiful palace paintings, essentially, that are on the walls of the palace of the Dahomey. And you know, and I say beautiful, like they're very violent and like show the women like decapitating people and whatever. But so it's interesting. So how do we, you know, it's hard to take this like rich text written by a white European man and try to contrast that with the perspectives you do have from the Dahomey themselves. Yeah. Because it's not, you know, it's a visual and you're making a lot of inferences about what that visual means about them.
With your own lens.
With your own bias lens.
So it's like, man, that's a tough analysis.
Yeah, it's really tricky. So I think that like lends to, I think a lot of people being insecure about talking about that rich history. And so it's hard because, you know, then we get these modern day, like we're always talking about, first prime minister, first from whatever country. Yeah. And it's like, yes, so true and so important and so interesting. But don't forget, there were a bunch of badass African queens who like dominated most of, you know.
Yeah, this is one, and it's not pop-up culture. It happens a lot, and it was pretty much their norm.
Yeah, right. So I just think it's really cool. And we, you know, this is post-colonialism. All the things that you learn about in school related to colonialism, their oppressive systems, their racist systems, it, you know, breeds war and violence. it also brings, like certain aspects of industrialization and, quote unquote, modern societies or whatever. But embedded in that, it's also bringing the patriarchy wherever it goes. In the United States, when you study U.S. history, like you have these vibrant matrilineal indigenous societies that are being taken over by patriarchal Europe. Wherever that goes, it's changing the way that gender is seen in that place. And Africa is no different. And so it's just so heartbreaking a little bit to me to know this like rich tradition of women's leadership and then to take all this time, all this colonial stuff to only in the 2000s have this woman elected to leadership. It just seems contrary to the tradition, but yet how cool. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf is the winner of a Nobel Peace Prize. So she's not just like
a leader. She's a kick-ass leader.
Yeah, she's amazing. So I'm really excited to have Professor Scully teach a little bit more about this amazing woman.
Awesome. Let's let her introduce herself.
Hello again. I'm Professor Pamela Scully. I'm Professor of Women, Gender and Sexuality Studies and Professor of African Studies at Emory University in Atlanta. I have my PhD in history from the University of Michigan, and I work on transnational gender and women's history. So I've written books on the ending of slavery in the British Empire, focusing on the Cape Colony, South Africa, looking at emancipation as a gendered project. I've co-authored a biography of Sarah Baartman, who was known as the Hottentot Venus. I've written on gender and slave emancipation in the Atlantic world with a colleague, and also a book called Writing Transnational History.
And your book on Sarah Baartman was a feature on a previous episode. So if everyone missed that and you're really loving this episode, go back and listen to our one on Sarah Baartman. And we did link your book in the show notes, so folks can check that out there. So today we're going to be talking about a much more modern woman. Would you mind telling us a little bit about her and why she's such an important topic for teachers to bring into the classroom?
Sure. So today we are talking about Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who is a pragmatic politician who made her way through very challenging times, including a civil war. She was born in Monrovia, Liberia, in October of 1938, and she is notable for a whole host of reasons, including that she won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2011, along with two other people. And she was president of Liberia in West Africa from 2006 to 2018, so fairly recently. And this made her the first elected female African head of state ever. And before that, she held influential positions in the United Nations, such as the UN Development Programme for Africa, the Development Fund for Women, as well as working for the World Bank and Citibank. And before that, she held various positions in various Liberian governments. So she really is quite a significant person in women in world history, let alone women's history.
Yeah, she sounds like a total girl boss.
She is, and along the way, she had a number of children. She got an MA in the United States. She is a really serious girl boss, and I think getting to know her a bit and studying her, students would be introduced to an African leader, a leading woman leader from Africa, an influential world leader on post-conflict reconstruction about how to try to heal a society after war, also an international feminist. And I think along the way, it would teach students about the country of Liberia, which is very important. But I would say, obviously for everybody, but for American students, it's important because Liberia was founded by settlers, both white missionaries and African Americans fleeing slavery in the United States. And there are lots of interconnected histories between these two countries, including, as I said, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was born in Monrovia, which is the capital of Liberia. And Monrovia gets its name from President James Monroe. So there's a whole history of really interesting relationships between the USA and Liberia that would be interesting for students to learn as they learn about this really important world leader.
Well, I don't want to insult our listeners by explaining where Liberia is, but just in case we have some people that are like, cool, Liberia, interesting. Where is that? For you all, we're talking West Africa, which is where many of the most powerful African kingdoms come from in history. Liberia is right next to Sierra Leone. Okay. So that should orient everyone to where we are, as you've oriented us to when we are. And I cannot wait to learn more about her because, yeah, I've had children, but I did not win a Nobel Peace Prize at the same time, nor manage the World Bank or these other things. What an amazing human. What sort of source? I mean, it sounds like because she's touched so many things, there isn't really an absence of sources for understanding this woman. What do you think are the best ones for getting a sense of who she is and bringing her into the classroom?
Well, what's lovely is she wrote a very good autobiography called, which gives you a sense of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, called "This Child Will Be Great." I wrote a short book on her for Ohio University Press's Short History of Africa series called Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, which is very accessible. It was written to be accessible. Helene Cooper has written a biography, which is an excellent biography of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. So, there's a lot of material in that sense. And then there's a really wonderful film, particularly for, maybe high schoolers, called Pray the Devil Back to Hell, about the women's movement in Liberia and the way that they forced the warlords to the peace table in the early 2000s. It was produced by Abigail Disney. It won lots of awards. It's very, you can get it anywhere, and it's very accessible. It would need some, I think, some priming about. There's certainly scenes. It's also about a civil war, so there are some scenes that are really horrible. But it is a wonderful way of seeing the context in which the sort of changeover to peace happened. It doesn't feature Ellen Johnson Sirleaf so much, but I think it'd be a very good resource. And then there are just lots of primary sources. So Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was really a leading person in a whole change, really, in the way that the United Nations approached civil war conflict and post-conflict reconstruction. And she and a number of people, but she and her colleague Elizabeth Wren wrote the United Nations kind of textbook, handbook on women, war and peace. And it details the challenges that women experience in civil war, the importance of having them at the peace table, that you can't just have peace treaties and negotiations done by men, because then the women's never get included ever, and that has implications for the post-conflict. So she literally helped write this huge handbook that you can see online.
Yeah, there's this sort of myth, right, that like men can sit around a table and think about women's issues and write some policies that would benefit, think about women and children. But it's
if you're lucky.
If you're lucky. And I think that's in theory, just like in theory, I can think about, things that would support, people of color, but like I am a white woman, like I need to own that and know that I have some things that I probably don't understand or don't get, and those people should be at the table so that we can resolve these things. So I think that's a really cool way. And it makes me think in a classroom when you're thinking about inquiry, I try to push people to diversify the curriculum in and especially women's diversity, right? And so here's a woman at the, in conversations at the UN level about how we bring about resolution after conflict. That could be the inquiry right there. How do you resolve conflict? And then you have a bunch of sources, one of them being this piece she wrote saying, get women at the table. So I think that's a really cool source, and I didn't know that it exists. So
yeah, and it's available. You can see, you can find it on the web. And the United Nations for this kind of thing is, a lot of they're also NGOs, but the United Nations, there's lots of information on the web if you wanted to work on that with students. There's also, for example, on Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, because she's so, she's just so fabulous. She gave an address to Congress in 2006, which is a video that one can access, so one can get a sense of her.
This is the U.S. Congress that she did?
Yes.
Okay.
And again, that speaks to the links between the US and Liberia. They go back, very far. Not always, not necessarily positive. One of them is the company Firestone, which makes, tires. They got an exclusive contract with the Liberian government way back when, in the 1920s, I think it was, where they kind of got an almost exclusive contract to the rubber. There's lots of rubber trees in Liberia, and that really funded Firestone's rise in terms of access to rubber, and it was not on good terms for Liberia at all. And so there is a long history between the two countries. So yes, so she's invited to the US Congress in 2006. I think she'd just been elected president that year. She'd just started her term. The other context is going in the route you were suggesting about women. How can one include women in peace treaties, and how can we include women so that societies after civil war and conflict are, as gender affirming as possible. There's a Security Council resolution 1325, which again is also very, very available. And there you can see, it's almost like if you look at that, you can see the principles which Ellen Johnson Sirleaf tried to govern when she became president are sort of, encapsulated in that resolution. And that security resolution was a very big deal. That was on women, war, and peace. That the UN actually made this resolution that women had to be included, and there were a whole series of other resolutions subsequently that looked at sexual violence in wartime and the need to look after children. And I've actually written about that. So on the web you could look up my name and see that there too. And then of course there are lots of newspaper reports everywhere on Ellen Johnson Sirleaf's work as president, so there's just lots. And then the Nobel Peace Prize site documents a few of her achievements. It's certainly not comprehensive, but there are lots of, different ways one could approach this. And she was given the Nobel Peace Prize precisely because of her work in trying to lift up women as important citizens of Liberia and the world, and making sure that they weren't left out after civil war. So.
When was the Liberian Civil War? You said
so
her.
There was a coup by a staff sergeant called Samuel Doe in 1980, and not exactly then, but pretty shortly after that, the country, descended into civil war. There are actually sort of two Liberian civil wars, but generally you could say from like mid-80s to around 2003. The country was at war, with some moments when they weren't. But what's interesting about Ellen Johnson Sirleaf is that she actually, she's not a universally popular figure because she is a survivor, and one of the ways she survived was, I think, to navigate through some extremely challenging situations. She was briefly in Samuel Doe's cabinet, I guess, and he was a scary guy, but she was also, in jail and prison and feared for her life at another point. I mean, she's had it's quite a life. My sense is, even if one could take issue with certain things, to be a leader is to do things that aren't always popular. It doesn't mean that they're even always right. But I think she is clearly someone of great stature who she is definitely worth knowing and knowing about. And I think because she's part of this generation of sort of second wave feminists in a way, but from West Africa rather than the US. But she is very much of the same kind of, I would say, wave of feminists in politics as Clinton and Hillary Clinton and co. That would be a generation that sought to make a change and moved into institutions and tried to do the best they could to kind of move those institutions, if only a little bit.
So it sounds like, if I am understanding this right, she is sort of a sympathizer with the guy who staged this coup.
No, I wouldn't call her a sympathizer. I think I would say Ellen Johnson Sirleaf sees herself as fundamentally a public servant. and thinks about it. Her skills were in finance. And so my sense looking at her career was, at least in Liberia, was, my sense is that she would think, okay, how can I best help here? And, at one point she was one of the few people who had, skills. She'd been to the States, done a master's there, et cetera, et cetera. And so I don't know. I think she's quite an independent woman who looks at the lay of the land and thinks about, okay, where could I help best? What are the ethical issues here? Where should I land? But I don't. I mean, also in the same vein, for a while she supported Charles Taylor, who maybe some people will remember as being connected to blood diamonds, and he became president of Liberia after Doe. He's a scary guy. I mean, he's now in jail, but she supported him for a while too, and that came up in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Liberia, that she'd been his supporter, and it caused her some problems. She's pragmatic. She's a pragmatic politician. I guess I think it's easier to judge, but she's had a very long career. Along the way, I think there are arenas where one would not always agree with her.
Yeah, but it seems like there's this series of kind of scary guys who come to power in a military,
Yes.
In the midst of civil war, and both of them are ousted, and they're like, hey, we need a pragmatic woman. Maybe that wasn't probably top of their criteria list, but pragmatic person who can get stuff done and bring in power. And I didn't realize, I guess the United States is involved in helping, we send a few hundred troops to help end this conflict and bring about peace, which is kind of nice. It would have been nice if it had happened, in 1980.
Yes, but I would say the United States relationship with Liberia is I wouldn't say one of aiding very much. It's more really, it's more, I think, of seeing how Liberia can help the United States. So, for example, at some point, Liberia was a place where the CIA used as a kind of base for various Cold War explorations in Africa and things. I think the terms on which the US has worked with Liberia have never really been to Liberia's benefits. The one thing I would say, though, since we are living at the moment where President Carter is in hospice, is President Carter, who also has a somewhat complicated relationship with Liberia. The Carter Center, President Carter has done election monitoring for many years, doing excellent work in protecting democracy around the world. But they did confirm that the election for Charles Taylor was, fair enough, I guess. And subsequent to that, some really, really bad stuff happened in Liberia, which I think was not good. And I think the Carter Center regretted that particular intervention. And I will say I've done work at the Carter Center, so I'm probably not completely neutral. But what is really remarkable about President Carter is he atones for things, I think. And so when the Civil War ended in Liberia and Ellen Johnson Sirleaf became president in 2006, she became president in January 2006, the Carter Center became very involved in Liberia, in helping train lawyers, in running a rule of law program, in democracy work. And there are lots of organizations that say they're doing good work, but the Carter Center really does. They appoint, at one point, the head of their Carter Center in Liberia was Liberian. They employed Liberians. It was a very different kind of place than quite a lot of these initiatives that I've seen. And again, actually thinking about that the Carter Center website also has a lot of information about Liberia and their work in Liberia in terms of working with local communities. And I would say it's a very good resource. So in that history of the US not having, I would say, great relationships with Liberia, I would say the Carter Center, since the ending of the Civil War, it really stands as an example of what can be done in terms of really good collaboration. And again, that's not the United States as the government, but it is an example of a really good, I think, way of working across boundaries.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious, how does Ellen Johnson Sirleaf bring everybody together? Like how do you do that in the midst of civil war and or in the aftermath of a civil war? Because it seems like this has been an ongoing war that has sparked multiple times. And how do you prevent it from sparking again? What did she do to bring about peace?
That is a really great question. And I think, one thing I would say is during much of the Civil War, because, her life was threatened, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was not in Liberia. So there's that. But when she came back, having campaigned and won, the presidency, one of the ways that she was successful.
Did she campaign from abroad?
No. She campaigned in Liberia. But She was away. And again, she hired an American election, dynamo to help her figure out how to reach different communities and things. Her ace in the hole, I think, was that she had all these international connections. She had contacts at the World Bank, at Citibank. She knew all the people she needed to know in the United Nations. And so, and there's a very, very big and important Liberian diaspora in the United States of people who fled during the Civil War and came over here, and, their children grew up here. There's a lot of back and forth between Liberia and the United States. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf called on everybody. She called on her friends in the UN. She called on Citibank. She phoned up the head of whatever and got. She really worked those phones, and she did. One of the reasons ended up, I think, giving a talk to Congress. She went around the world calling in the favors, saying, "You need to step up here. We need you, and you're going to have to help." And so she understood the importance of kind of shuttle diplomacy, going around the world, making sure that Liberian issues were visible to everybody. As a result, she has won every international prize you could possibly mention. It's if you go on Wikipedia and just look at all the prizes she's won, it's unbelievable. So she got people. So, for example, she called on a Liberian who had been a provost at one of the New York campuses, and asked if she could please come down and become president of one of the universities in Liberia. Please come out of retirement and help. And that person did. All the big NGOs like Doctors Without Borders, American Red Cross, the Carter Center, you name it, came to Liberia to help. The UN was there. There were peacekeepers in Liberia for years and years and years with their white trucks. And you'd go to a small village and there would be a little UN peacekeeping camp. So for example, maybe it's not a village, but Harper in Liberia is the southernmost town, and there was a big UN camp there, peace camp. So that is how she did it. I think that was the strength of her presidency, where she was able to bring in the big guns to say, okay, we need security, we need to figure out a way to get some money flowing back into the country, we need to figure out our debt issues, we need to renegotiate some of these contracts with foreign firms, etc., etc., etc. And she did it. It's really quite amazing. And she focused a lot on educating women. A lot of money was poured into girls' education, etc., etc. Again, I think that might also have be maybe the long-term challenge of her administration. It relied so much on the work and support of people from outside that I think it's very challenging to keep that going. I don't know what else she could have done. So this is not really like she should have done X as opposed to Y. I just think it is a cost possibly of bringing in so many people from outside. But she was very, very successful. And she won the Mo Ibrahim Prize for Good Governance, which this person with lots of money gives to a leader in Africa who, cedes their presidency, understands elections and democracy and moves on, and has done a very good thing for their country. She won that prize recently, a couple of years ago, in recognition of everything she'd done. So again, one can quibble with some of the things. So I think, in terms of guiding students through it too, because she's remarkable as a woman, she and you can see this from quite a young age, is that she seems to have had quite a good sense of self. She took us, she had children, she went off and went to university in the USA. She did get divorced after a challenging marriage. She ended up working in finance, which is not, certainly then wasn't the usual place for a woman. So I think just paying attention to what does it take for a woman to kind of really be successful would be interesting. And I think certainly, her work with the UN to make women at the center of decision making around peace and rebuilding societies is absolutely key. But in terms of, what for teachers to think about what students might need to know to really, fully appreciate what studying her, I do think obviously Liberia's history as a settler colony is very important, because there were a whole bunch of different little kind of colonies, I guess, on the coast. Again, out of America, some of them largely African American, by people fleeing slavery in the States. Some white missionaries who was in support, saying we don't want African Americans in the United States, so yes, we'll help you go back to Africa. So it's not a pretty picture. And those all those sort of different colonies came together to form Liberia in about 1847. But then they extended, really it is a kind of colonial rule over the interior indigenous societies. And that has to be understood, because it was really that tension that fueled the civil wars. So that I think need to know some of that history. They need to know something about the Liberian Civil War, and then definitely the rise of second-rate feminism. I mean, I think it's just an interesting topic, and would be, we're living in the wake of that generation of doing all that work. Yeah,
that's outstanding. We spend a lot of time in our classes talking about colonialism, and I think we need a lot more on decolonization. And it sounds like, Civil War coming out of a period of decolonization, sadly, is like a common theme. And because there's this like power vacuum, and she is the stability. And I think that's a really cool story for students to hear. Not only that countries can restabilize, but that a woman can be the one doing that. How important.
Absolutely. And also to know a story of a woman who does actually manage, because we also need inspiring figures. As ever, I think it's complex. Whether all she did for women lasts in Liberia, we don't yet know. What will Liberia look like in 20 years' time? Will there be little girls who went to school who are now able, imagine themselves as presidents and get to be presidents? I think she tried very hard. I should say that her first term is generally seen as more successful / popular. In her second term, it became more complicated in terms of sort of allegations of corruption and challenges. Again, she had to face Ebola. Liberia was very badly hit by Ebola. And I gave a talk on her last year, and I said, I think a key point about leadership are people who learn from their mistakes. And so when Ebola came to Liberia, President Sirleaf was initially didn't take the public health approach. She locked down one community where there was quite a lot of Ebola, and that led to a lot of protests and things. But then she took stock and realized she needed to really work with communities. Like the Carter Center helped there, but she worked with the chiefly elders. She worked with women's groups, and realized that it really had to be an approach that would talk to elders and talk about the importance of not hugging and saying hello like many Liberians do, and a lot of touching of hands. But that actually, and it's the hardest thing to do really, is to ask people, please don't touch the bodies of your dead, because that's going to keep the virus going. So she really, I think that's, even though there were failures at the beginning of Ebola, Liberia came out of Ebola first of the three countries, Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia, because of this public health approach. And it was before the US, by the time the US came through with doctors and camps and tents and things, Liberia was really well on the way to healing. And so I actually think that Ebola example is an example of her leadership as well, because it's about failing and then going, okay, how can I learn and do this better? And they did. It was really impressive.
Well, Dr. Scully, thank you so much for joining me on this episode. I think it's just so incredible to learn more about her, and to have, like you said, these like models for young people about somebody who can have a really complicated, I think you used that word several times today, have a really complicated life, and yet still, be a model for improving on mistakes and humility, but also, like we started with, just be a complete powerhouse. And I want to just remind everybody the list that you shared with me at the beginning. Nobel Peace Prize winner, leader of Liberia for 2 terms, worked for the World Bank, has an MA from the United States, had multiple children. Oh my gosh.
And I think 10 grandchildren. No, she's a force, and we should celebrate women who make something of their lives, for sure.
Thanks so much for listening to Remedial Herstory, the other 50%. Please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to your podcasts to bring more voices to the conversation. We really appreciate that effort. Until next time.